2 in the morning in a cold ICU room, Thomas Bennett knelt beside the hospital bed of Manhattan's most powerful CEO, gripping her lifeless hand. The words came out as a whisper, a confession he'd buried for 3 years. "I love you." No one knew if she could hear him. No one knew if she would wake. But the most terrifying thing wasn't death. It was the possibility that if she did wake up, would she accept love from the man who had always stood behind her, invisible and essential? 3 days before the accident, Thomas Bennett woke at 5:30 to the sound of his daughter climbing onto his bed. Emma was 7 years old, gap-toothed with tangled brown hair that refused to stay in any ponytail he attempted. She pressed her cold feet against his shin and whispered that she'd had a nightmare, dinosaurs eating her science project. Thomas pulled her close and told her the dinosaurs were vegetarians. She fell back asleep within minutes. He did not. By 6:15, he was in the kitchen frying eggs while Emma sat at the table with her homework spread out like a war map. She was building a model of the solar system using foam balls and wire hangers, and she'd already glued Saturn's rings on upside down. Thomas didn't correct her. He'd learned that mistakes were part of the process, and Emma learned best when she discovered problems herself. He plated the eggs, added toast, set the food in front of her without comment. She ate while explaining that Jupiter was technically a failed star, and he listened as if he'd never heard it before. By 8, he was at Shaw Industries, riding the elevator to the 42nd floor with a tablet in one hand and Olivia Shaw's schedule memorized in his head. He'd been her executive assistant for 3 years, and in that time, he'd become fluent in the silent language of her needs. Black coffee at 8:15, quarterly reports at 9, board calls at 10. She never ate lunch. She rarely smiled. She moved through her days with the precision of someone who'd learned early that hesitation was weakness. Thomas had loved her from the first week. He hadn't meant to. Love wasn't something he'd planned for after his wife's death, and certainly not love for a woman who barely looked at him outside of work. But Olivia had a way of existing that made the world feel both larger and lonelier. She was brilliant and cold and entirely unreachable, and Thomas had accepted his role as the man who stood behind her, invisible and essential. The morning passed in its usual rhythm. Olivia arrived at 8:10, walked past his desk without greeting, disappeared into her office. Thomas brought her coffee at 8:15. She took it without looking up from her screen. At 9, he placed the quarterly reports on her desk. At noon, he ordered her lunch, knowing she wouldn't eat it. At 3, he rescheduled a meeting she'd forgotten. At 5, he reminded her of a dinner with investors. She nodded. He left. This was the shape of their relationship, professional, distant, built on the understanding that Thomas's job was to anticipate her needs before she articulated them. It had worked for 3 years. Thomas had never once stepped outside the boundaries of his role. He'd never said her first name aloud in her presence, never asked her a personal question, never touched her except to hand her documents across the desk. But that evening, something shifted. At 7, when most of the office had emptied and the cleaning crew was vacuuming the hallways, Olivia appeared in the doorway of Thomas's workspace. She looked exhausted in a way that went beyond physical tiredness. There was a thinness to her expression he'd never seen before. She said his name, just his name, and asked if he could drive her home. Her driver had called in sick, and she didn't feel like taking a cab. Thomas said yes before his brain could process the request. He followed her to the parking garage where his 10-year-old sedan sat between 2 luxury cars that cost more than his annual salary. Olivia didn't comment on the car. She slid into the passenger seat, fastened her seatbelt, and stared out the window as Thomas navigated onto the Manhattan streets. The city lights blurred past them, reflecting off the glass towers that lined the avenue. For the first 5 minutes, neither of them spoke. Then Olivia asked him a question. She asked how he managed it, how he balanced being a single father and working the hours he did, how he stayed so calm when everything around him demanded urgency, how he managed to put other people first without losing himself in the process. Thomas didn't answer immediately. He changed lanes, signaled, merged into traffic. He thought about Emma sleeping in her bed, about the eggs he'd fry in the morning, about the 3 years he'd spent loving a woman who didn't know he existed outside of his function. He thought about his wife, about the way grief had taught him that love wasn't about possession, it was about presence. Finally, he told her the truth, or at least a version of it. He said that putting other people first wasn't about losing himself. It was about understanding that his value wasn't measured by what he kept, but what he gave. He said that being a father had taught him that love wasn't a transaction. It was a choice made every day in small, invisible ways. He said that balance was a myth, and what mattered was showing up, even when it was hard. Olivia listened without interrupting. When he finished, she turned to look at him for the first time since they'd gotten in the car. Her expression was unreadable, but there was something softer in her eyes, something that looked almost like recognition. She said she'd never thought about it that way. She said she'd spent her entire life believing that vulnerability was failure. She said she was tired. Thomas didn't know what to say to that. He kept driving, feeling the space between them shrink in a way that was both exhilarating and terrifying. For the first time in 3 years, Olivia Shaw wasn't her boss. She was just a woman sitting in his car, admitting that she was tired. They were 2 blocks from her apartment when the truck ran the red light. Thomas saw it half a second before impact, a flash of metal and headlights coming from the right side. His brain processed the trajectory, calculated the angle, understood that the truck would hit the passenger side first. He didn't think. He turned the wheel hard to the left, throwing his body between the collision and Olivia, and the world exploded into noise and glass and darkness. The impact threw them sideways, airbags deployed, metal screamed against metal. Thomas felt his ribs crack, felt his head slam against something hard. The world tilted and spun, and then went still. He couldn't see, couldn't breathe, but he could hear Olivia's voice, faint and far away, calling his name. He wanted to answer. He wanted to tell her he was fine, but the darkness pulled him under before he could speak.
When he woke, he was in a hospital bed with fractured ribs, a concussion, and a daughter asleep in the chair beside him. Emma's face was streaked with dried tears, her hand wrapped around his. A nurse told him he'd been unconscious for 6 hours. A doctor told him he was lucky. A police officer told him the other driver had been drunk and that Thomas's quick reflexes had likely saved both their lives. But no one told him about Olivia. No one mentioned her name. When Thomas finally found the strength to ask, the nurse's expression shifted into something careful and sad. She told him that Olivia Shaw was in the ICU. She told him that Olivia hadn't woken up. She told him that the doctors weren't sure if she ever would. Thomas closed his eyes and felt the weight of it settle into his chest. He'd saved her life, but he might have lost her anyway, and the worst part was that she would never know. She would never know that he'd turned the wheel. She would never know that he'd chosen her. 3 days after the accident, after Emma had fallen asleep, Thomas stood in his kitchen and stared at the phone number the hospital had given him for the ICU. He had no official right to information about Olivia's condition. He wasn't family, he wasn't her partner, he was an employee. But the nurse who'd handed him the number had looked at him with something like pity and told him to call after visiting hours if he wanted to know how she was doing. The next evening, after putting Emma to bed at her friend's house, Thomas drove to the hospital and took the elevator to the ICU on the 9th floor. The hallway was quiet, lit by fluorescent lights that hummed faintly above his head. A nurse sat at the desk, and when Thomas approached, he gave her Olivia's name and said he was her assistant. The nurse checked her records, frowned, told him that only family members were allowed in the ICU after 8. Thomas didn't argue. He simply asked if he could sit in the waiting room nearby. Thomas sat in the waiting room for 2 hours, watching the clock on the wall tick forward. At 10, the nurse appeared in the doorway and gestured for him to follow. She led him down the hall to a private room at the end, pushed the door open, and told him he had 15 minutes. Thomas stepped inside and heard the door close softly behind him. Olivia lay in the hospital bed, connected to machines that beeped and hummed in a steady rhythm. Her face was pale, her hair loose against the pillow, her hands resting at her sides, motionless. Thomas had never seen her like this. Even in sleep, Olivia had always seemed alert, as if some part of her was constantly calculating, planning. But now she looked fragile, and the sight of it broke something open in Thomas's chest that he'd been holding closed for years. He pulled a chair close to the bed and sat down. He didn't touch her. He didn't speak right away. He just looked at her and tried to reconcile the woman he knew with the woman lying in front of him. Then he began to talk. He told her about Emma's science project, about the upside-down rings on Saturn, about the way his daughter had cried when she heard about the accident. He told her about the eggs he made every morning, about the bedtime stories, about the ordinary rhythms of a life that probably seemed small compared to the empire she'd built. He told her about his wife, about the way she died suddenly from an aneurysm, about the year of grief that followed. He told her that he'd learned to live with loss by understanding that love didn't end when someone left. It transformed. It became memory and habit and the small acts of care that kept a person alive in the world even after they were gone. He told her that he'd been afraid to love again. And then he'd met her, and fear hadn't mattered anymore. Thomas went back every night. Each night he sat in the waiting room until the nurse let him in, and each night he spent 15 minutes talking to Olivia as if she could hear him. He told her stories. He told her things he'd never told anyone. He told her that sometimes he felt invisible, that sometimes he wondered if his life mattered to anyone outside of Emma. He told her that working for her had given him purpose, that watching her build something extraordinary had made him feel like he was part of something larger than himself. And on the 7th night, at 2 a.m, in the cold ICU room, Thomas knelt beside her and said the words he'd never dared to speak. He gripped her motionless hand and whispered that he loved her. He told her that he'd loved her for 3 years, that he'd hidden it because she didn't want it, that he'd accepted his role because being near her was enough. He told her that turning the wheel was instinct, that he'd do it again, that saving her life was the only thing he'd ever done that felt like it truly mattered. What Thomas didn't know was that Olivia could hear everything. She was trapped in a strange half-sleep, aware but unable to respond, listening to every word he said. At first, she hadn't understood who was speaking. Then she recognized him, Thomas, her assistant, the man who brought her coffee and rescheduled her meetings and existed in the background of her life like furniture she'd stopped noticing. But the words he spoke didn't match the role she'd assigned him, and Olivia, who'd spent her entire adult life building walls around herself, felt those walls crack open. She'd never let anyone close. She'd learned early that attachment was weakness, that people left, that trusting someone meant giving them the power to destroy you. Her mother was cold and critical. Her father had died when she was 12. She'd built Shaw Industries alone, without help, without partnership, without love. And now, in the dark space of her unconscious mind, Olivia listened to Thomas Callahan tell her that she was loved. On the 10th night, Olivia's mother and brother arrived. Thomas was in the waiting room when he heard their voices in the hallway, sharp and authoritative. Catherine Shaw was in her 60s, impeccably dressed, with silver hair and the kind of beauty maintained through discipline and expense. Her son, Richard, was 2 years older than Olivia, tall and lean with the same cold intelligence that ran in the family.
They swept into the ICU like they owned it, and in a sense, they did. Thomas heard Catherine say that they'll be limiting visitors to immediate family only. No employees, no friends, no distractions. He stood and walked to the nurse's desk where Catherine and Richard were still standing. He introduced himself as Olivia's assistant, and Catherine looked at him like someone might look at a piece of lint on expensive fabric. She told him his services were no longer needed, that the family would handle Olivia's care, that he should return to the office and focus on keeping the company running in her absence.
Thomas stood in the hallway and felt 3 years of quiet love harden into something colder and more desperate. But he had no power here. He had no claim. He was exactly what they said, an employee, invisible, disposable. He went back to the waiting room and waited until the hospital settled into the deep quiet of early morning. Then he walked back to Olivia's room one last time. He told her that he had to go. He told her that her family had arrived, that they didn't want him there, that he had no right to fight them. He told her that he loved her, and that he'd always love her, and that if she woke up and needed him, he'd be there. But he couldn't stay. He let go of her hand. He stepped back from the bed. He turned toward the door, and then he heard it, a sound, small, barely audible. He turned back. Olivia's fingers had moved, just slightly, just enough. Thomas's hand froze on the elevator button. Something held him in place, not hope, not logic, just the stubborn, irrational certainty that leaving now would be the worst mistake of his life. He turned around and walked back down the hallway. He pushed open the door to Olivia's room, and what he saw made him freeze. Olivia's eyes were open. Thomas crossed the room in 3 strides. He said her name. Olivia's eyes moved toward him slowly, as if the effort cost her everything. Her lips parted, but no sound came out. Thomas reached for the call button, but Olivia's fingers closed around his wrist. The grip was weak, but it was unmistakable. She was trying to tell him something. She was trying to keep him there. Finally, in a voice that was barely a whisper, Olivia said 3 words. She said, "I heard you." Thomas went still. The world narrowed to the sound of her breathing, the faint pressure of her hand in his, the way her eyes held his with an intensity that felt like falling. She repeated it. "I heard you." All of it. When the doctors finally gave them privacy, Olivia spoke first. She told him she was sorry for not seeing him, for treating him like he was invisible, for taking 3 years of his life and never once asking what he needed. She said she'd heard every word he spoke to her in the dark, every story, every confession, every moment of honesty. She said she'd been awake inside her own body, screaming for him to stay, unable to move or speak or do anything except listen. Then she told him about her childhood. She told him about her father's death, about the way her mother had responded by becoming harder, colder, as if emotion were a weakness that had killed him. She told him about Richard, about the way they'd been pitted against each other from the time they were children, taught that love was a competition and vulnerability was failure. She told him that she'd built Shaw Industries as a fortress, a place where she could be powerful enough that no one could hurt her. And then she told him that listening to him talk about Emma, about scrambled eggs and science projects and bedtime stories, had broken something open inside her. She told him that she'd spent 10 days in the darkness, hearing him describe a life built on love and care and small repeating acts of devotion, and she'd realized that she'd been wrong. Success wasn't a substitute for connection. Power wasn't a substitute for family. Before Thomas could respond, the door opened. Catherine Shaw walked in, followed by Richard. They stopped when they saw Thomas, and Catherine's expression hardened. She told Thomas she'd made it clear he wasn't welcome, that he needed to leave immediately. Richard added that if Thomas didn't comply, they'd have security remove him. Olivia's voice cut through the room like a blade. She told them to get out.
Catherine turned to her daughter, shocked, and Olivia repeated it. She said that Thomas was staying and they were leaving, and if they had a problem with that, they could take it up with her lawyers. She said that for 38 years she'd let her family dictate how she lived, who she trusted, what she valued. She said she was done. 2 weeks later, Olivia was discharged from the hospital. Thomas picked her up in his 10-year-old sedan. Emma sat in the back seat, quiet and wide-eyed, clutching a drawing she'd made of the three of them standing in front of a house. Olivia looked at the drawing, and something in her expression softened. She told Emma it was beautiful. The first morning, Olivia woke to the sound of Thomas moving around the kitchen. She came downstairs in borrowed clothes, her hair loose, her feet bare, and found him at the stove frying eggs. Emma was at the table working on her homework, and she looked up when Olivia entered. She asked if Olivia wanted to help with the new science project. Olivia said yes, even though she had no idea what she was doing. Thomas set a plate of eggs in front of Olivia and told her that breakfast was the most important meal of the day. Olivia looked at the plate, then at Thomas, then at Emma, and felt something unfamiliar rising in her chest. It took her a moment to recognize it. It was happiness, simple, uncomplicated happiness, built on scrambled eggs and construction paper, and the ordinary rhythms of a life she'd never thought she wanted. She thought about the ICU room, about the darkness, about the sound of Thomas's voice telling her she was loved. She thought about the choice he'd made, turning the wheel, putting himself between her and death. She thought about the 3 years he'd spent loving her in silence, and the 10 days she'd spent listening, and the moment she'd opened her eyes and seen him standing there. And she knew with the kind of certainty that had built her empire that this was the right choice. Love, real love, wasn't about power or position or proving anything to anyone. It was about showing up. It was about staying. It was about the person who stood behind you when you were strong and the person who stood beside you when you were not. Olivia reached across the table and took Thomas's hand. He looked up, surprised, and she told him thank you. He asked what for. She said everything. For the eggs, for the stories, for staying, for loving her even when she didn't deserve it. Thomas told her she'd always deserved it. Olivia said she was starting to believe him. Emma asked if they were going to be mushy all the time now. Thomas laughed, and Olivia smiled, and the sound of it felt like coming home.
For more videos, please subscribe, like, and comment.